Abraham Lincoln is without a doubt one of the most revered figures in American history. And part of this is due to his reputation as the man who preserved the Union during the Civil War, as well as his reputation as the great emancipator who ended slavery. However, all of this came to an end when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln in 1865. After Lincoln's assassination, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, took over. And Johnson, unlike Lincoln, lacked political skills, was basically combative and very hard to work with, and also showed no interest whatsoever in civil rights, and was obsessed with placating Southerners and former Confederates. While Lincoln would have pursued reconciliation between the two halves of the nation, Johnson's style and personality just ultimately caused even more division. Johnson's opposition to civil rights, as well as his just combativeness with the radical Republicans in Congress, played a role in the South being isolated from the rest of the nation for roughly a century after the Civil War, as well as for the progress of civil rights and just racial harmony in general being gutted down the toilet. So one would have to ask this question: what if Abraham Lincoln was not assassinated by John Wilkes Booth and lived out for his entire second term, and we didn't end up seeing who was arguably the worst president in American history take over at arguably also the worst possible time? So what if Lincoln was not assassinated and served out the rest of his term? So, one thing you have to understand about Lincoln is while he does have the reputation of the great emancipator and was arguably friends with Frederick Douglass, Lincoln's his main goal wasn't racial equality or even the abolition of slavery earlier in his career and when he was president, but rather it was simply the preservation of the Union, as his quote illustrates. Lincoln viewed the abolition of slavery as a means to an end, rather than the primary objective of the Civil War. He was opposed to the expansion of slavery, but by no means does that mean he supported abolishing it. In fact, by the standards of the Republican Party at the time, he would have been considered a more moderate to even conservative member of the party regarding his stance on slavery and racial issues. One of the main reasons that Lincoln did move towards emancipation was due to the presence of France and England as potential Southern allies during the Civil War, and to avoid this, he made the issue about slavery, which was something that the British and French were both deeply uncomfortable and disgusted with, in order to prevent them from joining the South's cause. Ultimately, Lincoln's main plan for Reconstruction was for leniency and the idea of just reconciliation rather than the idea of punishing the South or even forcing them to adopt civil rights, which is what radical Republicans wanted. So, Lincoln's policy regarding the readmission of Southern states was called the 10% rule, where if a mere 10% of residents in each Southern state vowed allegiance to the Union, the state would be readmitted. This was widely opposed by many Republicans, even some moderates, who thought that it should be more than this and that 10% was too low of a number. And without the presence of Lincoln and Andrew Johnson being president, and Johnson's inability to compromise, this ultimately led to Congress just going over his vetoes and then establishing separate military districts, which basically hurt the South even more, as it stripped them of their voting rights, many ex-Confederates, and it also hurt blacks, because what it ultimately did is it caused racist organizations to arise and ultimately terrorize freed slaves due to resentment of them having more political influence. I think Lincoln would have reached a compromise with the radical Republicans. He was able to work with them because, for one, he was also a Republican, and for two, he wasn't combative and he wasn't just mean like Andrew Johnson was. So, this ability to work with the radical Republicans would have likely caused some sort of compromise. I think what would ultimately happen is the threshold of men who had to pledge allegiance to the Union would go up from 10 to 33%. And I think you would also see less stringent requirements regarding the enfranchisement of former slaves. I think it would instead be something like if slaves were well educated, if former slaves were well educated or were veterans in the Union Army, they would then be allowed to get citizenship rather than complete and total enfranchisement. And I also think regarding punitiveness towards ex-Confederates, I think this would again only be exercised towards top Confederates rather than just average rank and file members. And I also believe that Lincoln would be issuing out pardons to many Confederates and would oppose radical Republican attempts at punitive measures or revenge. Four southern states that I think would accept this compromise would be the states of Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Louisiana. All of these states were relatively moderate with the exception of Louisiana at the beginning of the Civil War. And the states of Tennessee and North Carolina only barely seceded in the first place. Arkansas still had strong Union pockets, as did Louisiana. And while Louisiana was one of the initial seven to leave the Union, its its representatives and its members became more moderate over time, and it also became under the control of the Union Army relatively quickly. So I think all four of these states would accept Lincoln's new compromise. However, the remaining southern states would likely be reorganized into military districts. I don't think Lincoln would have been above doing this. He was known to use military influence at times to assert his control and to preserve the Union. And I think he would have done so here, dividing the rest of the southern states into five districts, with the states of Virginia and Texas being entire districts themselves, as well as South Carolina. So with this being the case, I think ultimately also former Confederates would not be disenfranchised. Lincoln would have been opposed to this. Andrew Johnson was opposed to this, but like usual, Congress just went over him. So I think Lincoln would have allowed former Confederates to vote, except for exceptionally bad ones. And I also think that regarding the civil rights bills that Andrew Johnson vetoed, Lincoln would probably sign those into law. And because of this, it would give the radical Republicans the impression that Lincoln could be worked with, unlike Andrew Johnson. Plus, Lincoln was just in general much more nice and much more friendly and much better politically speaking. He was very politically shrewd. Andrew Johnson was not. And then also regarding the Freedmen's Bureau, which gave protection to and also gave benefits to former slaves, Lincoln would have definitely signed this into law because it in many ways had formed his vision for what he wanted former slaves to be, which was well educated, literate, and then eventually, once they were ready, they would get the right to vote rather than instantly, like many radical Republicans wanted to. I think also you would see that the Ku Klux Klan and the White League and other terrorist organizations would not be formed, or maybe they would be formed, but their influence would be significantly lower because the main reason this happened in the first place was due to the presence of widespread African American voting rights as well as widespread ex-Confederate disenfranchisement. Neither of these would happen in this scenario, thus the cause of just terrorism, simply put, would not be as appealing. And I think Lincoln's executive enforcement would also far surpass Andrew Johnson's, like, easily regarding the protection of African Americans from these groups. So with that, I just don't think that the KKK and other organizations would have the same influence or have the same sort of terror that they did in our own scenario during this time. Regarding the 14th Amendment, I still think this does get passed and does ultimately get ratified by the states. Although it might be watered down a little bit, I still think it does happen. It might be watered down mostly due to the presence of some former Confederate states in the government at this time, but I think it does ultimately pass. And then regarding the remaining seven southern states that haven't rejoined the Union, I think they would eventually rejoin the Union around 1868 because, again, they need political representation. And I think by the time of the next election, all of the former Confederate states would have rejoined the Union, which is unlike our own scenario where the states of Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia had still not rejoined the Union by the time of the 1868 election. And I think when the 1868 election does roll around, Ulysses Grant would still be the Republican nominee. He would be a favorite among radical Republicans, mostly because of the fact that he would be viewed as more radical than Lincoln on the issue of Reconstruction. and they would want him to adopt a more hardline stance. And Horatio Seymour would still be the Democrat nominee. And in real life, this was a very lopsided election, according to the Electoral College. But this was actually quite deceiving, as Seymour almost won the popular vote. And it's actually estimated that Seymour won a majority of white men in this election. And one of the key reasons Grant won was not only because of the Electoral College, was also because of the disenfranchisement of many ex-Confederates in the southern states. And since this is not happening in this alternate scenario, I think you would see Seymour ultimately sweep the South and lose in a much more narrow election than he did in our own scenario. But with Grant only narrowly winning the election and possibly even losing the popular vote, I think we would ultimately see Grant be much more moderate. And also, Republicans would likely not have supermajorities in Congress at this time, considering how ex-Confederates and ex-Confederate states would be readmitted and would actually be able to vote, and the population of freedmen voting would be significantly lower. And due to this, I think Congress would be roughly 50-50, and this would make the passage of the 15th Amendment virtually impossible due to Democratic opposition. And I also think without without the 15th Amendment, and without Grant really pursuing a policy of radical reconstruction due to a lack of congressional support, we would also see a lot less corruption in his administration. I'm not saying that support for civil rights is what caused corruption, but the vast amount of federal government and federal resources, as well as Grant's poor oversight of those, is what ultimately led to the vast corruption of the Grant administration. And I think without this amount of massive government spread, I think we would not see the same extent of corruption under this new Grant administration. And ultimately, without the corruption and without really the racial issues going on to the same extent under this new Grant presidency, Grant's 2 terms as president would be very peaceful, which would be the complete opposite of what Grant's 2 terms would be in real life. So, yeah, that's the main difference. I think Grant, though, would still use the Justice Department to some extent. I don't even know if it may actually be formed, because without really the Ku Klux Klan posing that big of a threat, we might not even see the Justice Department get formed. And thus, in 1876, without Grant's bad reputation for corruption, Rutherford Hayes would win the election pretty convincingly. He'd win the states of Connecticut and Indiana, which he lost in real life, but he would lose states like Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, although he wouldn't really need them to win in this scenario. And thus, with a bigger margin of victory, there would be no need to end Reconstruction, so to speak. So the limited amount of African Americans who did have the right to vote in the South would likely still have their right to vote, but we would still not have a 15th Amendment that would guarantee the right to vote of all freedmen. Although, to be fair, after 1876, this right to vote was basically not even there at all in the South, and ultimately we would just see the same thing happen. And this might even be a little bit of an improvement because we would see some small amounts of African Americans actually able to vote. And when the time comes, I think the 15th Amendment would overall actually be passed, albeit significantly later, though the impact would roughly still be the same, which is black voters ultimately getting their right to vote in the South, likely around the 1950s to 1960s. The main impact of this alternate scenario isn't in the long term, but in the short term, where I think from the time between the end of Reconstruction to the World War II, we would see a lot less race riots and a lot less racial conflict. And even during the Reconstruction era, there would be a lot less violence in the South and even in the North later on. And I think just in general, these times would be a lot more peaceful for African Americans. So the lives of African Americans living in this time period would be significantly better, so to speak. But the long-term impact of this is very minimal if Honest Abe ultimately does not get assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. So, yeah, we can see the impact of Lincoln not getting assassinated, which is actually honestly a win-win for both the South and African Americans. For African Americans, they're not getting terrorized, they're not getting brutally beaten and killed, And for white Southerners, it's just that they're not having themselves divided into military districts, and they're not losing their voting rights, and they ultimately joined the Union much earlier. So ultimately, John Wilkes Booth assassinating Lincoln was actually the worst thing that could happen for the South during this time period. So anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel. Mr. U.S. History, out.